Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, let's pick up on Brexit, and who better to help us than the BBC's Europe editor, Katya Adler, and surprisingly, she's in Brussels. Welcome to the programme, Katya. A lot has happened here in Parliament this week. How's that been viewed from where you are?
Well, it's been viewed, really, with several bags of popcorn and not a few packets of crisps as well. I think, you know, basically, the way that people in this building behind me in the European Commission see this, and in capitals across Europe, is this is time for them to watch and to wait. They cannot get involved in what is absolutely a situation of domestic politics. But frankly, taking a bit of a wider look at this, this is how the EU has felt throughout much of the Brexit negotiation process. They feel in the EU that the government has spent so much time negotiating, arguing and fighting with itself that that has stopped it coming here to Brussels with a tough single line on Britain's behalf when it comes to Brexit. So this helps the EU feels that the cards really are in its hands. And as for what went on with Westminster this week, you know, the message here is we don't quite understand it, but when you've finished, we're here.
Right, Katya, stay with us. What's your reaction to that, Paul?
I think that's a very fair summary, and that whatever one's position is on Brexit, and I voted for Remain, although I'm a big critic of the European Union, what we've ended up doing, because the government doesn't have majority for its position, is that it can't, with any credibility, go and say anything. Including, as we're about to, I think, discuss, on the Galileo issue, on the security and defence issues. We're getting pushed around left, right and centre. And for a Conservative party, which has, you know, always sought to, as it were, embody the nation and sort of stride around the world, sort of proclaiming Britain's greatness. I mean, to be able to watch what Katya was saying there, it cannot be a source of pride, to be honest.
Well, the fact that the EU bodies, not the EU, most of Europe is actually rather sceptical about the European Union. The institutions of the EU, everyone is on the gravy train with a nice big pension. They don't like that we voted to leave and that the government is even going to enact a vote, because normally when people vote against the EU, they're told to vote again.
Right. I mean, Katya, are they doing this, as you said, with popcorn? Is it with glee that they are watching what they see as a certain amount of entertainment over here, or in sorrow?
It's not. I mean, that was a bit glib of me to say about the popcorn and the crisp. But literally, it's because they, like we, are in front of their television sets watching. Do not think for a moment that the EU just waits from negotiation round to negotiation round. People in this building are pouring through our press and watching what's on our television screens, which means that even when I go for background meetings, and mind what they say on the record, they will quote to me articles in various British newspapers. So they are watching everything extremely carefully. Glee, I would not say at all. And in fact, Theresa May has a lot of sympathy amongst the EU leaders. I mean, I wouldn't say support in Brexit, because the EU's line, and it is still very much felt in all European capitals, they really wish it wasn't happening. They do believe that it is happening, though, and as such, they kind of want to get on with it. They want to have a successful deal for the UK and for the EU. Obviously, the EU is outgunning for itself. It wants to get the best deal that it can get. But if the UK's economy is in the doldrums, that won't help the EU either. If the UK is in political crisis, that doesn't help its neighbours in the EU either. So glee, absolutely not. Impatience, frustration, yes.
All right, stay with us, because as we mentioned earlier, the EU's migrant crisis may have slowed, but it hasn't stopped. Here's Adam Fleming with more.
When we get the information, we will inform you. So this is why, don't worry, you are here safe and we will find a safe place for you. Okay?
The safe place wasn't Italy for the 629 migrants rescued by a charity in the Mediterranean this week. They were barred from entry, a strong message from the new Italian government, an alliance between the radical Five Star Movement and the tough on immigration League Party.
We cannot accept anymore that NGOs, so private institutions, will bring people, migrants, to our harbours. That was clearly stated. We will accept only people and migrants that have right to come in the European Union and that are bring to our harbours by official international military missions.
That new government and this boat have turbocharged the long EU debate about migration. The Parliament, the Commission and the Member States have been going round in circles for more than 2 years trying to construct a common asylum policy that pleases everyone. The proposal's made up of lots of different elements, which are quite difficult to get your head round, but it boils down to this. Are countries prepared to take in people who didn't arrive at their borders? MEPs are still smarting from the migrant crisis and the failure of the EU's scheme to share out asylum seekers.
You have countries who did not even take one immigrant, either from Italy or Greece, to help these particular countries. There are only 2 countries who fulfilled the relocation quota. Those are Malta and Ireland. All the other countries did not fulfill the relocation quotas. So if we really believe in solidarity, if these member states really want to help out in this situation, why couldn't they have at least fulfilled the relocation quotas that they had to fulfill?
There is a democratic element here as to whether a country wants to be multicultural or not. Hungary says no, we don't want to be multicultural. We used to be that before 1914, but then Britain, France turned us into a monocultural country, so leave us alone now.
A potential answer doing the rounds here this week is that the EU should set up reception centres in non-EU countries, an idea we put to the Migration Commissioner, Dimitris Avramopoulos.
Can you give me an example of a country that has accepted to host such a camp in its soil, somewhere in Africa or in Asia?
So that's your way of saying it's not a good idea?
No, I say that if it is practically good, why not? But so far, we listen to these ideas without having any concrete proposal. Because, as I told before, these countries must open their doors, welcome this initiative, and tell us, here we are to do it.
Now the debate about avoiding another migration crisis moves from the European Parliament to a showdown at a summit of EU leaders at the end of the month.
Adam Fleming reporting there. Well, let's talk to Katja Adler again about this huge issue for the EU. Can you just give us a sense of the sort of context in terms of the scale of the migration crisis, as so many people see it in Europe, and the effect it's had on the EU?
OK, well, first of all, I'd say that you'll all remember the height of the migrant crisis back in 2015, when more than 1 million irregular migrants came into the European Union, many of them into Greece. Or remember some of those British holidaymakers lying on the beach there when those boats were arriving of many Syrian refugees trying to escape the conflict there. That was the height of the crisis. Since then, the numbers have gone down considerably. And in fact, you know, I heard when you were talking in your introduction there about the current migrant crisis, if you look at the frontline Mediterranean countries of Italy, Greece and even Spain, they'll say to you this crisis never went away between 2015 and now. But the rest of the EU, once those numbers, those big numbers had dropped and people stopped flooding across the continent, the rest of the EU countries not directly affected were pretty happy to turn away. Spain's Prime Minister this week said, like ostriches burying their heads in the sand. This has all come out again this week because Italy refused to take in the Aquarius boat carrying, you know, hundreds of irregular migrants, and this has brought it front and centre back into European politics. As for how it's affected the EU, hugely, of course. You talk about European Union. Migration is certainly an issue where all you see is European disunity. If you want to go back to 2015, EU countries couldn't fast enough slam the doors on each other to stop those migrants coming into their country. Now, again, you see the countries bickering in amongst each other. What I would say to Julia there, as regards people who want to leave the EU, this is an issue that tears the EU apart. But when you ask, at the moment, opinion polls in most of the EU, it's not that people want to leave the European Union, but they want it reformed. They want it massively reformed. And migration is front and centre in one of the top priority lists.
Right. I mean, listen, that's very interesting, isn't it, in terms of whether it has provoked anti-EU sentiment, which it clearly has to some extent, but not so much that people are saying we want out. Do you agree with that?
It's fuelled parties that are more Eurosceptic. So if you look at the AfD in Germany, if you look at the Freedom Party in Austria, if you look at the Lega in Italy, their main issue has been migration, but they have pre-existingly, as it were, sceptic positions on Europe, such as wanting to either come out of the euro in the case of the Lega Nord, or renegotiate Maastricht. So what's happening is that the conservative, I would argue xenophobic right is getting muscle from the quite clear and legitimate concern that people have about uncontrolled migration into Europe.
What do you think about that, Katia? Is that true from where you stand, that it has fuelled those populist, as Paul calls them, and sort of more to the right in terms of political parties?
I'm always very careful when, before I say it fuels those parties, because I think, we have to always ask ourselves, whether it's the United States or Europe, where are these parties coming from? I mean, they're filling a gap in the market. What Paul said there are very legitimate concerns. So there are European citizens across the continent who worry about migration, who worry about globalization, who worry about all sorts of things, and they feel that their voices haven't been heard. You then have populist politicians, for want of a better word, and we can analyse what we mean by populist politicians, but they are diving into this issue now because they see a gap in the market. And I think that when you look at the Aquarius issue this week, you can see how one EU politician after another scrambled to make political capital of it. On the one side, you have Italy's Interior Minister, Matteo Salvini, who has really come to fame, to national fame of late, on an anti-migration ticket. On the other hand, the new Prime Minister of Spain, Pedro Sanchez, who tried to make new stripes here in Brussels by saying, OK, Italy doesn't want them, I'll take these migrants in. And they're not alone. I mean, look at Germany as well, and the kind of interior clashing and bashing that's going on with the very right to the Conservative Party Interior Minister there, who also wants to really crack down on migration compared to Angela Merkel. Yes. So, when we talk about migration, it's on two levels. The actual migration issue, and there is a yawning gap in EU policy to find a common, workable, accepted solution for all the member states. And then domestic politics, those who worry actively, voters who might worry about migration, and politicians who really, to be honest, cynically use that situation to make political points.
I mean, has it exposed, it probably has in your mind, exposed to some extent the impotence of those EU institutions? Because here, nation states and their political situations and their priorities to their home nations has trumped what could have been an EU common policy.
Well, yes, democracy is trumped. This is the thing, is the people of these countries have voted for national governments through coalitions or whatever to do their will. I know this is old-fashioned, but it might catch on one day. And it's fascinating, the big dividing lines within the EU, between the northern European states, the Mediterranean states who've borne the brunt of that mass migration, of illegal immigrants, economic migrants. I completely understand that there are 5 billion people probably in the world who would like to have life that is offered in Europe, but unfortunately the European people haven't said, yes, we'll share it with you. That's just not how it works. But also you've got the Eastern European countries, which is interesting, whether they're left-wing or right-wing governments who've just said, no, thank you, we're not going to be told what to do by the EU, we're going to bow to what our people want.
I think that the big danger in all of our nightmares, whether we're pro or against the European Union, the nightmare is it breaks up in an uncontrollable way. And the way in your nightmare it does that is if the Merkel government falls and switches to the right, as the Austrian government did. Now, what's happened, and it was alluded to there, Alexander Dobrindt, the leader of the CSU, the sister party of Merkel's party, has come out really strongly in favour of this Austrian-Italian line. And that is right now, today, undermining Merkel's authority.
No, and Angela Merkel undermined her authority when she basically invited a million people, undocumented, unproven, didn't know who they were, into the country.
Let's agree on that. She cancelled Dublin III unilaterally, dumped the problem onto Eastern Europe and Greece. They didn't want it, and that is a simmering problem for Europe.
Right, how dangerous is it, Katia, listening to that, if we look at the German situation particularly, and whether she, Angela Merkel, and Austria and Italy are going to somehow work this out amongst themselves? Is this a moment of danger for the EU?
I like to turn things on their head, really. You say it's dangerous. I'd say it's an opportunity for the EU, because with all those member states, the EU really never takes dramatic action unless proverbial backs are really well and truly up against the wall. Arguably, we're at that situation at the moment, with linchpin Germany in such trouble over the migration issue once again, now within the government and within the governing party, if you like, itself. Could this actually now finally galvanise EU countries to take some actions? I would argue, more now than 2 weeks ago, or even a week ago before the Aquarius debacle. As for individual nations, you know, the EU is made up of individual nations, so they do have to talk to each other to try and bounce ideas of each other before they come and sit here, which they will do here in Brussels at the end of the month. If they start that conversation only now, you know, when they actually come here, forget it. I mean, forget an all-nighter, it would be an all-yearer. So they actually do need to talk to each other, and it makes sense. What I would like to say, though, is they haven't had much success so far when it comes to migration. And when we go back to 2015, what actually stopped the flow of migrants across the continent wasn't the Brussels solution, which was to make that questionable deal with Turkey to stop refugees coming across. It was more Austria, again, taking the initiative and blocking that route from the south of Europe to the richer north that the migrants had wanted to take. And arguably, that is what slowed the figures down. Now again, you see Austria trying to lead an initiative. Denmark has another one. Other countries are trying to have a look at how to move forward in migration. They don't often agree. One thing they would all agree on at the moment, all the EU member states, is they have to talk about migration, and they absolutely have to do something. And they know in Italy they have a very unpredictable government.
Katja, thank you for joining us for that interesting discussion there in Brussels.
It's taken months for Angela Merkel's government to take shape, but now a tense dispute which goes right to the heart of Europe's biggest problem is threatening to tear it all down. At its heart, this statistic: of the nearly 4.5 million asylum applications in the EU in the last 5 years, over 40% have been made in Germany. The Chancellor has fallen out with her Interior Minister over the immigration policy that made her name. Merkel has stood firm against unilateral moves to turn refugees back from Germany's borders. Horst Seehofer from the junior CSU party in her coalition has urged her to back down, while the standoff echoes the deepening divisions across Europe over how to handle the vast number of migrants and asylum seekers heading to the continent. Today, the French President Emmanuel Macron and Italy's Prime Minister Conte called for radical change to the EU policy. It was the policy that made Merkel and forced the world to see her country in a different light.
EU member states must share the responsibility of asylum-seeking refugees. Germany is a strong country. Our economy is solid, our labour markets are robust, and we even have the capacity to take in more skilled workers.
70 years on from the horrors of World War II, Germans were reborn, re-envisioned as a nation that welcomed foreigners to its shores, opened their doors and gave handouts to those in need. It won Merkel respect from many in the international community and secured her Time Person of the Year. But it was a policy that would divide Europe and left many furious. The German invitation encouraged many to attempt the long trek across Europe through Hungary, Slovenia, where the governments were much less sympathetic to the refugee cause. And the rise of new populist governments in Europe, Italy and Slovenia itself most recently, have been in large part a response to the refugee crisis their countries felt was out of control.
Let me make it absolutely clear, Europe will not be able to carry this burden on her own. If there is no change in the current trend, Europe will be destabilized.
When 600 or so migrants got stranded in the Mediterranean last week, Italy, following the mandate of its electorate, said no thanks. Malta, the same. And now Germany itself, once seen as the new Jerusalem, is facing that same battle. Merkel's Interior Minister, from a sister party in her coalition, wants to turn back refugees at the German border. The Chancellor herself is refusing. 2/3 of Germans say they want refugees turned away. 53% say Merkel hasn't managed the influx well, but 64% approve of her overall job performance. Wolfgang Schäuble, Bundestag President, is acting as cabinet mediator.
The management of migration is one of the biggest global problems for the Western world.
The question right now may focus on Germany, Merkel and her own political survival. But don't be fooled into thinking it's about one leader, one party, one country. The right of an individual state to control its borders and that human obligation to help those in dire need
are on a collision course that is reshaping the politics of the entire continent. So what happens now?
It's quite a big question, that one. They're joined from Baden-Baden in Germany by Kai Whittaker, an MP in the Bundestag from Angela Merkel's CDU party, one of her MPs, in other words. Kai Whittaker, it's very nice to have you on the programme. When you put that figure into context, Germany accepting 41% of all asylum applications for the EU in the last 5 years, it is clearly well-meaning, but politically a disaster, isn't it?
No, it just shows that Germany is not only the biggest country in Europe, but also one of the most attractive ones, because we have a growing economy now in the 10th year of Angela Merkel's government, and that is the very reason why so many people try to get to Germany.
But you must be concerned with what it has done now to your own share of the vote, seeing the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, rising up. You can't pretend this has nothing to do with the immigration policy. It's caused a backlash, it's caused division, and German people are tired of it, aren't they?
Well, I don't pretend it is a controversy, and it's putting pressure on Germany, on German politics. And yes, we need to solve that migration crisis, but Germany won't solve that on its own. We need a European solution.
But do you think maybe her interior minister has got his finger on the pulse right now? Is Chancellor Merkel in trouble?
Well, we are all in trouble if this goes horribly wrong next week. So everybody needs to think quite carefully over the weekend what to do next. Europe needs a stable German government, and it would be foolish to end this coalition. So I hope we can resolve the conflict by the end of next week.
Do you think that's where it's actually heading? You sound concerned.
Well, we are looking forward to a conference of the CSU on Monday, where they will decide what to do next, and potentially a parliamentary group session on Tuesday. And then we will see how things unfold.
I'm going to push you on this one. Do you think that Angela Merkel can survive this? It is a big political test for her.
Well, she can survive this because she made clear that this is a question of principle. Is Germany turning away from multilateral agreements among Europe and going into a national direction? She thinks that's the wrong way to go down, and that's why she fights for her legacy.
Sure, but fighting for your legacy is not the same as political survival. You know what the summer's going to look like. You know that more boats will be in the Mediterranean. There will be optics of more people trying to land on Europe's shores. Do you think that Merkel will last the summer?
I don't see why not, because we have achieved quite results in the past 3 years. We brought down the number of refugees coming into Europe and into Germany. We are not quite there where we want to be. That's why we need a European solution. That's why we also need to be better on national policies. But that's now up to decide in the next week.
Let me ask you very briefly, do you sense that failure to properly sort this out is what is pushing people towards the populist movement right across Europe?
Sure, some people have the impression that we don't have a grip on this problem, and we must do everything to seize control over the situation.
Kai Whittaker, thank you very much. Thanks for joining us. Let me bring in Nina Schlick. She is the European political commentator from the Rasmussen Global organisation. Just tell us, Nina, your sense of what sources inside the German government are telling you, because we heard from Kai there, very straight but clearly concerned and limited in what he's actually able to say as one of her MPs. What is your sense of what's going on now?
So obviously my sources in Berlin are saying that the situation is very fraught. It's on tenterhooks. Nonetheless, having said that, the cardinal rule in German politics is never underestimate Angela Merkel. That is the rule since 2005. People have been saying that she's gone for about 13 years. Clearly, the interesting issue here is that her interior minister is also the former minister-president of Bavaria, that is the state in Germany that bore the brunt of the migration crisis in 2015. At a certain point, you had 10,000 people a day crossing into Bavaria's borders. Bavaria is facing a state election in October. It's in the CSU's interest to be very hard on migration policy because they are afraid they might lose their absolute majority in those state elections, and the AfD is going to sweep up a lot of the votes.
So who's going to blink then? Is the Interior Minister prepared to concede, or is she going to help him out?
It would be very interesting. So this poker that the Interior Minister Seehofer is playing, the ball is really in his court. Because if he blinks, that would probably mean that the government falls. And we've already had a very, very difficult period of coalition building. I don't think the electorate wants to see a return to new elections. There's no indication that you'd have a different result if there were to be a new election. So I think the question is, will the CSU blink on the understanding that it would cause political instability in Germany and also potentially risking a return to new elections? And is that something that the electorate would forgive them for?
Do you think that the German electorate is still behind Angela Merkel?
Well, her approval ratings are extremely high, 64%, even though I will not deny that the issue of migration is a very important question in Germany, and I think it's going to shape German politics for decades to come. And nonetheless, she, in 2015, let in 1 million refugees and refugee and asylum seekers. This is not legal immigration we're talking about. This is completely different from free movement or anything of the sort. And she won a 4th term after that. I mean, that's astounding. That would not happen in any other European country or Western country that I can think of.
But you can sense what is happening across Europe, and you know that now individual countries, whether it's Italy, Malta, they're all acting in a unilateral way. That's going to be the future now for immigration, isn't it?
Absolutely. I've always said that I think the migration issue is the issue that could tear apart the EU. I've never seen such big divisions when it comes to the EU, not even at the height of the Eurozone crisis. So what Merkel is really pushing for here is that she sees this not as an issue of her own personal legacy, but indeed an issue for the legacy of Europe. If each of the countries are to shut down their borders and pursue national interest, then she's afraid that the entire project could come tumbling down.
Nina Sheikh, very nice to have you here. Thank you.